You know, there are moments in life that feel like they're lifted straight out of a sitcom, only you're not laughing. You're standing there, dust on your jeans, sweat dripping down your brow, wondering if you accidentally wandered onto a hidden camera show. This was one of those moments, only the stakes felt considerably higher than a cheap laugh track. It all started with a dream, as many good stories do. My dream wasn't about fame or fortune, not really. It was about space, about peace, about a little slice of land I could call my own, complete with a rambling old ranch house that needed more than a little TLC. For years, I'd saved every spare penny, worked overtime shifts until my eyes felt like sandpaper, and pored over listings in the dead of night. The dream was a ranch, a place where the nearest neighbor wasn't close enough to borrow a cup of sugar without a 5-minute walk, a place where I could finally breathe. And then, after what felt like an eternity of searching and hoping, I found it. The Whispering Pines Ranch, they called it, though most of the pines had seen better days, and the whispering was probably just the wind finding its way through a few loose shingles. It was perfect, structurally sound, but cosmetically, well, let's just say it had character. Lots and lots of character that translated to work. I didn't care. The closing was a blur of signatures and handshakes, and then the keys were in my hand. My keys, to my ranch. The feeling was indescribable. The first day I officially owned it, I just walked the property line. A goofy grin plastered on my face, the scent of dry grass and distant cattle filling my lungs. This was it. This was home. The moving process, however, was less idyllic. I decided to do most of it myself, with the help of a rented truck and a couple of very good friends who I'd bribed with promises of endless barbecue once I was settled. The first load was the essentials. Tools, some basic furniture, and box after box of things I probably didn't need but couldn't bear to part with. The ranch was at the end of a long, dusty road, part of a sprawling, loosely defined community that, unbeknownst to me at the time, had an HOA. An HOA for a collection of ranches and larger properties. It sounded odd, but I'd briefly scanned the packet of documents at closing. It seemed mostly concerned with road maintenance and shared well agreements, pretty standard stuff for rural setups. Nothing in there screamed, nightmare neighbor on the horizon. I wouldn't have even called her a neighbor. Not really. Her property, as I'd later learn, backed onto a far corner of mine, separated by a thicket of overgrown mesquite and a rather dilapidated barbed wire fence that was probably older than I was. But on that first sweltering afternoon, as I was wrestling a particularly stubborn armchair out of the truck bed, I wasn't thinking about HOAs or property lines. I was thinking about how good a cold glass of water would taste and whether I'd remembered to pack the coffee maker in an easily accessible box. The house itself was set back quite a ways from the main community road, down its own private driveway. It was quiet, save for the chirping of crickets and the occasional moo from a distant field. That was the appeal. The solitude. Little did I know my solitude was about to be very rudely interrupted, and my dream was about to acquire a rather shrill, unwanted soundtrack. I remember grunting, finally getting the armchair onto the porch, my t-shirt clinging to my back. My hair was a mess, I probably had a smudge of dirt on my cheek, and I definitely looked like someone who'd been doing manual labor all day because, well, I had. I propped the front door open with a cinder block I found by the steps, another item on the long list of things to fix. That's when I first saw her. Not clearly at first, just a figure, standing near the end of my long driveway, where it met the community access road. She was mostly in shadow, partially obscured by a large, overgrown oleander bush that marked the corner of what I assumed was her property line, though I hadn't paid it much mind. I figured it was just someone curious, maybe a welcoming committee of one, though she wasn't exactly advancing with a casserole. I wiped my forehead with the back of my hand, gave a tentative wave, and called out, "Hello there!" Friendly, right? That's how you start off on the right foot with new neighbors. Or so I thought. The figure didn't wave back. Instead, I could now make out a woman's shape, clad in what looked like pristine gardening clothes despite the distinct lack of a tended garden anywhere near her, just stood there, arms crossed. Then, she took a few steps forward, emerging into a patch of sunlight. She had a tight, permed hairdo that looked like it could withstand a hurricane, and a face that seemed permanently pursed, as if she just sucked on a lemon. "Can I help you?" I called again, a little louder this time, trying to keep the exasperation out of my voice. I really needed to get these boxes inside before the sun set. She finally moved, marching down my driveway with an air of authority that suggested she owned the place. Or at least thought she did. "This is private property," she announced, her voice sharp and carrying easily in the still air. It had that distinct tone, the one that immediately sets your teeth on edge, the Karen tone, for lack of a better term. I blinked. "Yes, it is," I said, managing a smile. "It's mine. Just moving in today." I gestured towards the rented truck, overflowing with my worldly possessions, as if that wasn't obvious enough. She stopped about 10 feet away, her eyes raking over me, then the truck, then the house with undisguised disapproval. "I haven't seen you around here before," she stated, not asked. "And I know everyone in this community." "Well, like I said, just closed on the place," I replied, trying to maintain a semblance of politeness. "Name's Alex. Nice to meet you." I even offered a hand, which she completely ignored. "This house has been vacant for some time," she continued, her gaze narrowing. "Are you sure you have the right address?" Now, I'm generally a patient person, but being questioned like a lost child when I'm standing on my own property, sweating buckets from hauling my own furniture, started to chip away at that patience. "Yes, I'm quite sure," I said, my smile becoming a little more strained. "Got the keys right here." I patted my pocket. "Look," I added, "I'm really busy trying to unload this truck before it gets dark. Was there something specific you needed?" Her eyes narrowed further. "I'm just making sure everything is above board. We have a very particular community here. We look out for each other. And for suspicious activity, I looked down at myself, dusty, sweaty, definitely not looking like a CEO on his day off, but hardly a master criminal. "The only suspicious activity here," I said, trying for a light tone, "is how much stuff I seem to own. Pretty sure some of these boxes are breeding." She didn't crack a smile. "I'm part of the homeowners association," she declared, as if that explained everything and granted her universal jurisdiction. "And I've received no notification of a sale or new occupants for this address." "Well, the sale closed last week," I said. "Perhaps the paperwork is a bit slow. These things happen." I turned back towards the truck, hoping she'd take the hint. She did not. "I think," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, yet somehow still accusatory whisper, "that you're not being truthful. I think you might be trespassing. Or worse." I straightened up, the armchair forgotten. "Worse? What exactly are you implying?" "I'm implying," she said, puffing herself up slightly, "that you could be burglars. This property has been empty. It's a prime target." My jaw nearly hit the dusty porch floor. Burglars? In broad daylight, with a clearly marked rental truck full of mismatched boxes and secondhand furniture? Was she serious? "Ma'am," I said, trying to keep my voice level, "I assure you, I own this house. I have the deed, the mortgage documents, my driver's license with this address once I get it updated. I am not a burglar." "That's what a burglar would say," she retorted with unshakable conviction. And then, she pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the authorities. They can sort this out." My mind reeled. The police? She was actually calling the police on me for moving into my own home? This couldn't be happening. "Are you serious?" I asked, a note of disbelief creeping into my voice. "You're going to call the police because I'm unloading boxes?" "It's my duty as a concerned citizen and an HOA board member," she sniffed, already dialing. "We can't be too careful." I just stood there, watching her, a mix of anger, frustration, and sheer bewilderment washing over me. This was my welcome to the neighborhood, my dream ranch, and already on day one, I was being accused of felony by a woman who looked like she ironed her socks. The dream, it seemed, came with a Karen-shaped asterisk, and as I heard her telling the dispatcher about suspicious individuals and a possible break-in in progress at my address, I knew this was just the beginning of something truly monumentally absurd. The quiet peace I'd craved felt a million miles away, replaced by the impending wail of sirens. The wait for the police felt like an eternity, even though in reality it was probably only 15 or 20 minutes. Every rustle of leaves, every distant dog bark, made me jump. Karen, whose name I still didn't know but whom I'd mentally christened HOA Karen Prime, stood her ground at the end of my driveway, phone still clutched in her hand like a scepter of righteousness. She watched me with the intensity of a hawk spotting a field mouse, occasionally glancing down the road as if willing the cavalry to appear. I, on the other hand, had retreated to my porch, sinking onto the very armchair that had been the subject of my efforts when this whole circus began. I felt a strange mix of emotions. Indignation was high on the list, closely followed by a sort of weary disbelief. Was this really how my new life in the country was going to kick off? Defending myself against accusations of grand larceny on my own doorstep? I considered trying to reason with her again, but one look at her rigid posture and self-satisfied expression told me it would be a fool's errand. She was clearly dug in, convinced of her own astuteness in uncovering this crime wave of one. Instead, I pulled out my own phone and quickly texted my friend Mark, one of the guys who was supposed to help me later. "You are not going to believe this. Just got accused of robbing my own house. Cops on the way. Welcome to the neighborhood, I guess." His reply was instantaneous. LOL. What? You serious? Need bail money? I managed a weak smile. At least someone found humor in this. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the adrenaline coursing through me. I had done nothing wrong. I had every right to be here. I had proof. It was just the humiliation of it. The sheer audacity of this woman. Finally, in the distance, I heard the faint but unmistakable sound of sirens. They grew steadily louder, and a knot tightened in my stomach. Even when you know you're innocent, the arrival of law enforcement, especially under these circumstances, is unnerving. 2 patrol cars, lights flashing, pulled up to the end of my driveway, effectively blocking it. Karen immediately strode towards them, gesturing emphatically towards me and the house. I could see her talking animatedly, her head bobbing. 2 officers got out, 1 male, 1 female. They listened to Karen for a moment, then turned their attention towards me. They approached cautiously, their expressions neutral but professional. "Afternoon, sir," the male officer said, his hand resting near his sidearm. "We received a call about a possible burglary in progress at this residence." "Afternoon, officers?" I replied, standing up slowly, trying to project an air of calm I definitely wasn't feeling. "I can assure you, there's no burglary. This is my house. I just bought it. I'm moving in today." Karen, hovering just behind them, let out a disdainful scoff. "That's what he says. But he just showed up, started unloading things. It's very suspicious." The female officer looked at me. "Do you have any identification on you, sir? And anything to prove ownership of the property?" "Absolutely," I said, reaching slowly for my wallet. "My driver's license still has my old address. I haven't had a chance to update it yet, just closed last week. But I have the closing documents from the sale in my briefcase in the truck. And the keys, of course. I handed over my license. The male officer took it, examined it, then looked back at me. "And the closing documents?" "Right in the cab of the truck," I said. "In a blue briefcase on the passenger seat. You're welcome to retrieve it or we'll accompany you," he said. So, with Karen watching like a vulture, I walked to the truck, flanked by 2 police officers, to retrieve the evidence that I wasn't, in fact, a hardened criminal making off with my own dilapidated armchair. Felt surreal. I handed over the thick folder of closing papers, the deed, the settlement statement, all the official paraphernalia that proves you've just indentured yourself to a bank for the next 30 years. The female officer took the folder and began to leaf through it, while the male officer kept an eye on me, though his posture had relaxed slightly. After a few minutes of silent paper rustling, the female officer looked up. "The names and details seem to match Officer Miller," she said to her partner. She then looked at me. "Mr. Henderson, it appears these documents are in order. This does seem to be your property." A wave of relief washed over me. so potent it almost buckled my knees. "Thank you," I said, my voice a little hoarse. I told her as much, but she wasn't convinced. Officer Miller turned to Karen, his expression now decidedly less neutral and more tired. "Ma'am, it appears this is a misunderstanding. Mr. Henderson is the new legal owner of this property." Karen's face contorted. For a moment, I thought she was going to argue with the police too. But he was acting so suspiciously," she sputtered. "He didn't look like he belonged here." "Ma'am," Officer Miller said, a hint of steel in his voice now, "people moving house often look disheveled, and there's no law against unloading boxes onto your own property. We've verified his ownership. There's no crime here." Karen's shoulders slumped, just a fraction, but her expression remained mutinous. She muttered something under her breath that sounded suspiciously like, "Well, I still think something's not right." The officers exchanged a look. "All right, Mr. Henderson," the female officer said, handing back my documents and license. "Sorry for the disturbance. Looks like you can get back to your move." "Thank you, officers. I appreciate you sorting this out professionally," I said, genuinely grateful. They nodded, gave Karen one last look that was a mixture of warning and weariness, and headed back to their patrol cars. As the sirens receded down the road, a heavy silence descended, broken only by the chirping crickets, who seemed entirely unfazed by the drama. Karen was still there, by the oleander bush, looking thoroughly deflated but still radiating disapproval. I just looked at her. I didn't say anything. What was there to say? She'd called the cops on me, embarrassed me, wasted everyone's time. All because I didn't fit her preconceived notion of who should own a ranch in her community. Finally, without a word, she turned and stalked off towards her own property, disappearing behind the overgrown foliage. I let out a long, slow breath. Round one, I guess, to me. But the victory felt hollow. This wasn't the fresh start I'd envisioned. My dream was already tainted by this bizarre, unsettling encounter. And I had a sinking feeling that this HOA Karen wasn't the type to just let things go. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. It was beautiful, but I barely registered it. All I could think about was that pursed face, that accusatory tone, and the chilling ease with which she'd escalated a simple hello into a police matter. I still had a truck full of boxes, and now a deep sense of unease. Welcome to Whispering Pines, indeed. The next few days were a blur of unpacking, cleaning, and trying to ignore the lingering sense of being watched. I'd catch myself glancing towards the end of my driveway, half expecting to see Karen lurking there, but she remained conspicuously absent. Maybe, just maybe, I thought she'd realized the error of her ways and decided to leave me in peace. Oh, how naive I was. The first official salvo from the HOA arrived about a week after the police incident. It wasn't a cannonball, more like a passive-aggressive pebble, but it landed with a thud nonetheless. It was a crisp, white envelope, official-looking, tucked into the rural mailbox at the end of my drive. Inside, a neatly typed letter informed me of a violation. Visible storage of moving boxes in driveway exceeding 48 hours. It cited some obscure bylaw I hadn't even noticed in the ream of paperwork I'd received. My boxes weren't in the driveway, mind you. They were stacked neatly on my porch, awaiting sorting and unpacking. And the moving truck had been returned days ago. This was clearly a targeted complaint. The letter was signed by a Mildred Perkins, HOA secretary. I had a very strong suspicion who Mildred Perkins might be a close associate of, if not Karen herself using a different title. I crumpled the letter in my fist, then smoothed it out again. Okay, fine. Annoying, petty, but manageable. I'd make a concerted effort to clear the porch boxes that weekend. I wasn't looking for a fight. I just wanted to settle in. But the letters didn't stop. A few days later, another one arrived. This time, it was for unmaintained landscaping, excessive weeds, and overgrown shrubbery. I looked around my yard. Yes, it was overgrown. The previous owners had clearly let things go. That was one of the reasons I got the place for a decent price. It needed work, a lot of work. I hadn't even been here a full 2 weeks. Did they expect me to magically transform acres of neglected land overnight? This letter also helpfully pointed out the daily fines that would accrue if the violation wasn't rectified within 7 days. 7 days to clear what looked like a decade of enthusiastic weed propagation? It was absurd. Then came the notice about improper parking of a commercial vehicle on a residential lot, referring to my friend Mark's pickup truck when he'd come over to help me haul some larger debris to the dump. It wasn't a commercial vehicle in any operational sense. It was his personal truck that he also used for his contracting business, but it did have his company logo discreetly on the door. Apparently, that was enough to trigger another violation. Each letter was polite on the surface, quoting bylaws and regulations, but the undercurrent was undeniably hostile. It was clear Karen, and I was now convinced she was the driving force behind this, whether she was Mildred Perkins or just whispering in her ear, was weaponizing the HOA against me. She couldn't get me arrested for being a burglar, so now she was trying to fine me into oblivion or harass me into leaving. The stress started to build. Every trip to the mailbox filled me with a sense of dread. What fresh nonsense would I find today? Instead of feeling joy and excitement about my new home, I was feeling besieged. I started talking to myself, muttering under my breath as I tackled the endless list of chores, both the ones I wanted to do and the ones the HOA was now demanding I prioritize. Excessive weeds, she says. Has she seen the state of that fence line between us? Pretty sure that's a fire hazard, Madam Secretary Perkins, or whatever your name is today. My dream of peaceful, rural solitude was rapidly turning into a bureaucratic nightmare orchestrated by a woman with too much time on her hands and a serious control complex. I realized I couldn't just ignore this. These fines, however ridiculous, could potentially add up. They could put liens on my property. This wasn't just an annoyance anymore. It was a genuine threat to my hard-won home. The initial shock and disbelief were morphing into a slow-burning anger, and with it, a sense of determination. She wanted a fight? She clearly didn't know who she was dealing with. I might look like a disheveled guy hauling boxes, but I wasn't a pushover. I'd worked too hard for this place to let some busybody in a power trip tiara chase me away with a barrage of paper cuts. The peace I craved might be further away than I thought, but if I had to go through a war to get it, then so be it. It was time to stop reacting and start strategizing. It was time to learn the rules of her game, and then figure out how to play it better than she did. My ranch wasn't just a house on some land. It was my sanctuary, and I was going to defend it. The era of polite compliance was over. The era of meticulously documented, bylaw-quoting, strategic resistance was about to begin. Karen had poked the bear, and this bear was starting to wake up and smell the coffee. And the BS. The first step in any battle is to know your enemy, and to know the terrain. In this case, the enemy was clearly HOA Karen, whose actual name I'd learned from a gossipy but ultimately friendly cashier at the local feed store was, indeed, Carol Pritchard. And no, she wasn't Mildred Perkins, but they were reportedly thick as thieves on the HOA board. The terrain was the dense, convoluted jungle of the Homeowners Association bylaws and covenants, conditions and restrictions, the dreaded CC and RS. I brewed a large pot of coffee, spread the entire HOA document packet across my rustic kitchen table, which was still surrounded by unpacked boxes, a silent testament to Carol's ongoing campaign, and dove in. It was like reading stereo instructions written by a committee of lawyers who were all paid by the word. Dense, jargon-filled, and mind-numbingly dull. But buried within those pages, I sensed, were the keys to my defense and perhaps my offense. I read about easements, architectural controls, nuisance clauses, and the proper procedure for submitting complaints and appealing violations. I highlighted sections, made notes in the margins, and cross-referenced clauses that seemed contradictory or overly vague. One thing became immediately clear. Carol was using the HOA rules like a cudgel, picking and choosing and interpreting them in the most aggressive way possible. For instance, the visible storage of moving boxes clause was, upon closer inspection, intended for items left in public view on common areas or for genuinely abandoned belongings, not for boxes neatly stacked on a private porch during an active move-in period. The unmaintained landscaping clause had a provision for new homeowners to submit a landscaping plan and a timeline for improvements, which I obviously hadn't been informed about. I'd just gotten the demand and the threat of fines. The commercial vehicle rule was so ambiguously worded it could technically apply to someone driving for Uber if they parked in their own driveway. As I waded deeper, I started to see patterns. The HOA, at least under its current leadership, seemed to thrive on this kind of selective enforcement. I decided I needed more intel. The feed store cashier had mentioned that Carol had been on the HOA board for years and had a reputation for being particular. I needed to talk to other neighbors, the ones who weren't part of Carol's inner circle. This was trickier. I didn't want to come across as a troublemaker stirring the pot, especially since I was the new guy. I started slowly. When I saw someone out working on their property, I'd wander over, introduce myself, and make some casual chit-chat about settling in. Most people were friendly, if a little reserved. After a bit of small talk, I'd casually mention the barrage of HOA notices. "Is this pretty standard around here?" I'd ask, feigning naive curiosity. The reactions were telling. Some would get a guarded look, murmur something non-committal, and change the subject. These, I figured, were either Carol's allies or people too intimidated to speak up. But others would lean in conspiratorially. "Oh, you've met Carol then?" One older gentleman, Mr. Henderson, no relation, ironically, chuckled dryly as he repaired a fence line. "She's a character. Likes things her way." He told me Carol had run unopposed for HOA president for the last 3 terms because no one else wanted the headache of dealing with her if they tried to challenge her. Another neighbor, a younger woman named Sarah who raised alpacas on her few acres, was more direct. "She's a nightmare," Sarah said, rolling her eyes. "She tried to fine me last year because she claimed my alpacas were non-conforming livestock, even though the bylaws clearly state agricultural animals are permitted. Took me 3 months and a certified letter from my lawyer to get her to back down. Bingo. This was valuable. Carol had a history. She bullied, she blustered, and she backed down when faced with legitimate, well-prepared opposition. Sarah also gave me a crucial piece of advice. Document everything. Take pictures. Keep copies of all correspondence. Log dates and times. If it comes to a formal hearing, you'll need it. I learned that the HOA board meetings were sporadic, often poorly attended, and largely controlled by Carol and her secretary Mildred Perkins, who acted as her loyal enforcer. Decisions were often made with little transparency. The more I learned, the more my frustration solidified into a cold, hard resolve. This wasn't just about my boxes or my weeds. It was about an abuse of power, a petty tyranny in a place that was supposed to be about freedom and space. I also started looking into Carol Pritchard herself. Not in a creepy, stalkerish way, but just observing. Her house, visible from a bend in the community road, was immaculate. Too immaculate. The lawn looked like a putting green, the hedges were geometrically perfect, and there was never a leaf out of place. It was the kind of militant tidiness that often belies a deep-seated need for control. And I noticed something else. According to the plat map I'd studied from my closing documents, a small, triangular section of what she clearly used as her extended side yard, the bit with the perfectly manicured rose bushes right up to where my property began with its wilder mesquite, actually seemed to encroach slightly onto my property line. It wasn't much, maybe a few feet at its widest point, but it was there. Interesting. I also started paying very close attention to the HOA's own adherence to its rules. The bylaws stipulated, for example, that violation notices had to be sent via certified mail if fines were being imposed. Mine had all come regular post. They also required photographic evidence of the alleged violation to be included with the notice. None of mine had any. Small details, perhaps, but in a war of bureaucratic attrition, details mattered. My kitchen table was now my war room. The HOA documents were my battlefield map. And Carol Pritchard, with her permed hair and pursed lips, was the opposing general. She thought she was dealing with some hapless newcomer she could easily intimidate. She was about to find out I was a very quick study, and I was learning her own rulebook better than she probably knew it herself. The initial shock of her police call had worn off, replaced by a steely determination. I wasn't just going to defend. I was going to make sure she regretted ever thinking she could make my life a living hell. The Whispering Pines Ranch was mine, and I was digging in for the long haul. The next phase of my campaign was all about meticulous preparation and turning Carol's own tactics against her, or at least preparing an unassailable defense. Sarah's advice echoed in my head: document everything. So, I became a fiend for documentation. I bought a new printer with a scanner function and a hefty supply of ink and paper. Every HOA letter, no matter how trivial, was scanned, saved digitally with a date and timestamp, and the original filed away in a rapidly expanding binder labeled simply HOA. I responded to each violation notice in writing, formally and politely, but firmly. For the boxes on the porch violation, I sent a letter explaining that I was in the process of moving in, that the boxes were temporarily staged for unpacking, and cited the bylaw section that differentiated this from abandoned property. I included dated photos of the porch showing the boxes diminishing day by day. For the unmaintained landscaping notice, I drafted a polite letter stating that I was a new owner, that I was assessing the extensive work required, and that I would submit a formal landscaping plan and timeline within the 30-day period allowed by Bylaw X, subsection Y, or a clause I was fairly certain Carol had conveniently overlooked when firing off her demand. I even took to photographing my own progress. See, dear HOA, here are the weeds I pulled today. Here is the shrub I trimmed. It felt ridiculous, but I knew this level of detail would be crucial if things escalated. The real game changer, though, was the security cameras. I'd always planned on installing some for general security, given the somewhat remote location of the ranch. Carol's antics just sped up the timeline. I bought a multi-camera system, good quality ones with night vision and motion detection, and spent a weekend strategically placing them. One covered my front porch and driveway entrance. Another watched over the side of the house that faced the general direction of Carol's property, though it was still a fair distance and mostly trees. A third covered my back patio and tool shed. They were all conspicuously visible. I wasn't trying to hide them. Let her know she was being watched, just as she was clearly watching me. It didn't take long for the cameras to prove their worth, though not in the dramatic way you might expect at first. There were no midnight lurkers, other than raccoons. But what they did capture was Carol. On several occasions, the motion sensor on the driveway camera would trigger, and I'd review the footage to see her car driving slowly past my entrance, much slower than normal traffic, the driver's head clearly craned to get a good look at my property. Sometimes she'd even stop for a moment at the end of the drive, peer in, then drive off. It wasn't illegal, just creepy and indicative of her obsession. Then there was the footage of Mildred Perkins, the HOA secretary, hand-delivering another notice. Instead of just putting it in the mailbox, she walked right up to my porch, peered through the front window, luckily the blinds were down, then taped the notice to my door. The camera caught her craning her neck to try and see inside around the edges of the blinds. Again, not a huge crime, but it showcased their intrusive methods. I made sure to save these clips, carefully labeled. The most telling incident, though, involved that disputed property line. I'd casually started clearing some of the brush on my side of the old barbed wire fence that separated my land from the area Carol treated as her extended garden. Nothing aggressive, just trimming back some of the wild growth. A few days later, a new letter arrived. Unauthorized alteration of established property boundary markers and vegetation. It accused me of damaging shared fence line and encroaching on neighboring property. This was Rich. I hadn't touched the fence, which was falling apart on its own, and I was well within my own property lines according to the plat map. I responded politely, stating I was clearing brush on my own property and attached a copy of the relevant section of the plat map highlighting my boundaries. I also mentioned that perhaps the HOA should consult the plat map themselves, as it appeared some of her prize-winning rose bushes near that boundary might, in fact, be enjoying sunshine on Henderson land. I didn't accuse, just observed. The next day, my side-facing camera caught Carol herself, trowel in hand, furiously digging up and moving 3 rather large rose bushes about 5 feet back from where they had been, deeper into what was undeniably her property. She kept glancing nervously towards my house as she did it. She didn't know about the camera, of course, but it was a delicious little piece of footage. She knew she was in the wrong and had quietly rectified it, but not before sending me an official, accusatory letter. I saved that clip with a mental gold star next to it. The constant scrutiny was exhausting. I felt like I was living in a fishbowl. Every time I stepped outside, I wondered if Carol was peering through her binoculars. Every nail I hammered, every plant I put in the ground, I half expected a new violation notice to materialize. But with each documented interaction, with each piece of evidence I gathered, my sense of control grew. I wasn't just a victim of her harassment anymore. I was building a case. My binder was getting thicker. My digital archive of photos and videos was growing. I was still tired, still frustrated, but now there was a grim satisfaction in my preparations. Let her keep sending her letters. Let her keep watching. I was ready. The quiet life I'd moved here for felt like a distant dream, but the fight to reclaim it was becoming a very consuming, very real present. And I had a feeling the next act in this drama wasn't far off. Carol wasn't the type to be deterred by a few polite letters and a plat map. She'd escalate, and I would be waiting. The anticipated escalation wasn't long in coming. It seemed my meticulous responses and subtle pushback, particularly regarding the property line and her hastily relocated rose bushes, had only served to poke the hornet's nest. Carol Pritchard was not accustomed to being challenged, and certainly not by a newcomer she'd already pegged as an undesirable. The next envelope in my mailbox felt heavier, more ominous. This wasn't just a friendly little violation notice. This was a formal summons to an HOA board hearing. The charges were numerous and, frankly, laughably exaggerated. I was accused of persistent and willful disregard for community standards, failure to rectify multiple outstanding violations, unauthorized construction, referring, I presumed, to a small chicken coop I'd started building well in the back of my property, perfectly permissible by the bylaws for personal use, and creating a visual nuisance detrimental to neighborhood property values. The letter informed me that the board would be considering significant fines and further enforcement actions up to and including legal remedies if these issues were not immediately and satisfactorily resolved. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks' time, in the small, rarely used community clubhouse. This was it. This was her big play. She was trying to publicly shame me, to overwhelm me with a barrage of trumped-up charges, and to rally the board, which I suspected was largely her and Mildred Perkins, to impose crippling fines. Part of me felt a surge of anxiety. This was getting serious, but a larger part of me felt ready, almost eager. She was bringing the fight to a formal venue, and that was a venue where my carefully collected evidence would shine. I immediately called Sarah, the alpaca lady. "She's done it," I said. "Summon me to a board hearing." Threw the kitchen sink at me, accusation-wise. Sarah whistled. "Wow, she's really going for it. Don't let her intimidate you, Alex. She relies on bluster. Most people just cave." "I'm not caving," I said, feeling a surge of adrenaline. "I've got my binder." "Good," Sarah said. "Know your bylaws inside and out. And if you can, try to get a few other reasonable homeowners to attend. Carol hates having an audience that isn't already on her side." That was good advice. I thought about Mr. Henderson, the older gentleman. He seemed fair-minded. Maybe a few others I'd had brief, positive interactions with. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing as if for a legal battle, because in a way it was. I organized my binder, tabbing key documents, copies of every violation notice, my dated and photograph responses, printouts of relevant bylaw sections, the plat map, even stills from the security camera footage, discreetly, of course. I wasn't planning on showing the Rosebush retreat video unless absolutely necessary, but having it was comforting. I drafted a clear, point-by-point rebuttal to each of her accusations. For the unauthorized construction of the chicken coop, I had the bylaw that explicitly permitted small outbuildings for personal agricultural use, along with photos of my modest, neatly built coop which was nowhere near completion anyway. For the visual nuisance claim, I had dated photos showing the gradual but steady improvements I was making to the landscaping, alongside the original state it was in, proving it was getting better, not worse. I also did a little more digging into past HOA meeting minutes, which were, according to the bylaws, supposed to be available to all homeowners. It took some persistence and a formal written request to Mildred Perkins, who initially claimed they were filed away and difficult to access. But I finally got copies of the last year's minutes. They were illuminating. Attendance was often minimal, sometimes just Carol, Mildred, and one other sleepy board member. Decisions were often recorded as unanimously approved, with little detail of any actual discussion. It was a rubber stamp operation. I even took a drive around the entire community, camera in hand, discreetly photographing other properties. Not to be a tattletale, but to document the general standard. I found several homes with far more significant deferred maintenance than mine, peeling paint, genuinely junkyard-like side yards, even a dilapidated boat on blocks in one driveway that had clearly been there for years. If my half-finished chicken coop was a visual nuisance, what were these? I wasn't going to throw other people under the bus, but it was useful to demonstrate the selective nature of Carol's enforcement. The day of the hearing arrived, a gray, overcast afternoon that matched my mood. I put on a clean, collared shirt, wanting to look respectable but not overly formal. My binder felt like a shield. I'd managed to convince Mr. Henderson and Sarah to attend, just as moral support and as neutral observers. When I walked into the small, musty clubhouse, Carol and Mildred Perkins were already seated at a folding table at the front, looking severe and important. There were only two other board members present, a Mr. Grumbles and a Mrs. Albright, who both looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Carol shot me a look that could curdle milk. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice dripping with disapproval, as if my very presence was an affront. "Please be seated," she gestured to a lone chair placed opposite the table, like I was a defendant in a courtroom. Sarah and Mr. Henderson took seats a little further back. The room was quiet, save for the hum of an old fluorescent light. Carol shuffled her papers, cleared her throat, and began. "This hearing has been called to address multiple, serious violations of the community covenants by Mr. Alex Henderson, owner of Lot 17. She launched into a litany of my supposed sins, her voice growing more strident with each point. She painted a picture of me as a slovenly, disrespectful scofflaw who was single-handedly dragging down the impeccable standards of Whispering Pines. I sat there, listening patiently, my hands resting on my binder. I made eye contact with her occasionally, my expression carefully neutral. I could see Mildred Perkins nodding along vigorously to Carol's every word. Mr. Grumbles was examining his fingernails, and Mrs. Albright was staring at a water stain on the ceiling. When Carol finally wound down, her face flushed with indignation, she looked at me expectantly. "Well, Mr. Henderson, what do you have to say for yourself?" This was my moment, the moment I'd been preparing for. "Thank you, Miss Pritchard, members of the board." I began, my voice calm and steady, a stark contrast to her earlier tirade. I opened my binder. "I do have a few things to say, and some documentation I'd like to share in response to these allegations." Carol's eyes narrowed, but she gestured impatiently for me to proceed. "Firstly," I said, "regarding the claim of persistent and willful disregard for community standards and failure to rectify multiple outstanding violations, I have here copies of every notice I've received, along with my dated, written responses to each one, submitted well within the time frame stipulated by the bylaws." I passed a neatly collated set of these documents to each board member, including Carol and Mildred, who took them with a sniff. "As you can see, I have addressed each concern, provided explanations, and in the case of the landscaping, submitted a phased improvement plan as per Bylaw 73, which allows new owners 30 days to do so. The initial notice I received failed to mention this provision." I saw a flicker of something. Annoyance? In Carol's eyes as I quoted the specific bylaw. Mildred began flipping through the papers with a frown. "Regarding the unauthorized construction of a chicken coop," I continued, "Bylaw 114 clearly permits small outbuildings for personal agricultural pursuits, provided they meet setback requirements and are maintained in good order. My coop, which is not yet complete, adheres to all listed requirements. I have photos of its current state and a diagram showing its placement well within my property lines and respecting all setbacks." I passed around another set of documents. Mr. Grumbles actually looked at these with a glimmer of interest. Mrs. Albright was now looking at me instead of the ceiling. As for the accusation of creating a visual nuisance detrimental to neighborhood property values, I paused. then pulled out another set of photographs. These photos, taken over the past few weeks, document the progressive improvements I've been making to the property since taking ownership. Here is the before, as it was when I purchased it. I showed a picture of the truly overgrown front yard. And here are shots from just yesterday, showing considerable clearing and initial planting. I then added carefully. While I am committed to making my property aesthetically pleasing, I also note that visual nuisance can be a subjective term. For context, I have also observed several other properties in the community that appear to have significantly more deferred maintenance, yet I am unaware of similar enforcement actions being taken against them. I didn't name names or show those photos, but the implication hung in the air. Carol bristled. That is irrelevant, Mr. Henderson. We are discussing your property. With all due respect, Ms. Pritchard. I replied evenly. Fair and consistent application of the bylaws is highly relevant. Bylaw 21 states that enforcement should be equitable. My concern is that these numerous violations, many of which I believe are misinterpretations or misapplications of the rules, seem to have arisen very shortly after I moved in, starting with a rather unfortunate incident where I was wrongly accused of burglary on my own property and the police were called. I saw Mr. Henderson, my neighbor, nod subtly from the back. Sarah was trying not to smile. Carol's face was turning a distinct shade of puce. That incident has no bearing on these violations, she snapped. Doesn't it? I asked quietly. It established a rather adversarial tone from the outset. For example, the very first notice I received, for boxes on the porch, cited a rule intended for abandoned items in common areas, not for an active move-in on private property. Furthermore, none of the notices I received included photographic evidence of the alleged violation, nor were they sent via certified mail if fines were implied, both of which are procedural requirements outlined in Appendix B of the HOA Rules and Regulations. I tapped my copy of the HOA documents. These procedural irregularities could, in themselves, invalidate the notices. Mildred Perkins finally spoke up, her voice thin and reedy. We don't always adhere strictly to every little detail if the violation is clear, but adherence to your own established procedures is crucial for fairness and legality. Wouldn't you agree, Ms. Perkins? I countered politely, especially when significant fines and legal action are being threatened. There was a tense silence. Mr. Grumbles was now looking directly at Carol, as was Mrs. Albright. They didn't look sleepy anymore. They looked thoughtful. Furthermore, I pressed on, deciding to go for the subtle but clear checkmate regarding her earlier personal actions. There was a notice concerning alteration of property boundary markers and encroachment. I responded with a copy of the official plat map showing my actions were well within my own property. Interestingly, shortly after I sent that response, pre-existing landscaping features near that boundary which appeared to be on my land were relocated. This suggests that perhaps the initial assessment of encroachment was, in fact, incorrect and possibly directed at the wrong party. I didn't mention the video. I didn't need to. The look on Carol's face was priceless. It was a mixture of fury, shock, and dawning horror as she perhaps realized I might know more than I was letting on. She looked like she'd swallowed a wasp. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Mr. Henderson chose that moment to clear his throat from the back. If I may, he said, his voice calm and reasonable. I've lived in this community for over 20 years. Young Mr. Henderson here seems to be making a genuine effort with a property that was neglected for some time before he bought it. And frankly, his documentation seems pretty thorough. Perhaps there's been some overzealousness in pursuing these matters so quickly against a new resident, Sarah chimed in. I also had some issues with bylaw interpretations in the past that required significant effort to resolve. Consistency and clarity are really important. Carol looked cornered. The united front she'd expected from her board was crumbling. Mr. Grumbles finally spoke. Well, Carol, he said slowly, looking at the papers I'd provided. He does seem to have a point on several of these procedural things, and the bylaws he's quoting. They are in there. Mrs. Albright nodded. I agree. Threatening legal action based on what seems to be a series of misunderstandings and perhaps some procedural missteps on our part. It feels a bit much. Carol Pritchard looked from Mr. Grumbles to Mrs. Albright, then to me, her eyes blazing. But the wind had clearly been taken out of her sails. She was used to steamrolling, not to being systematically rebutted with her own rules. This is outrageous, she finally sputtered, but it lacked its earlier conviction. Mr. Henderson is clearly trying to make excuses. Ms. Pritchard, I said calmly, I am not making excuses. I am presenting facts and citing the rules your organization is ostensibly governed by. I simply wish to live peacefully on my property and be a responsible member of this community, treated fairly and according to the established regulations. I believe my documentation demonstrates my commitment to that. The air in the little clubhouse was thick with unspoken accusations and dawning realizations. Carol was, for perhaps the first time in a long while, speechless. The power dynamic in the room had decisively and very satisfyingly shifted. The silence that followed my final statement was profound. Carol Pritchard stared at me, her jaw working, but no sound emerged. Mildred Perkins was shuffling papers nervously, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Mr. Grumbles and Mrs. Albright exchanged a significant look. It was Mr. Grumbles who finally broke the silence. Well, Carol, he said, his tone no longer sleepy but firm. Based on what Mr. Henderson has presented and frankly, based on the bylaws themselves, I don't see grounds for these extensive actions. Many of these complaints seem to be either premature, procedurally flawed, or based on a, let's say, very strict interpretation that hasn't been consistently applied elsewhere. Mrs. Albright chimed in. I concur. Threatening fines and legal action at this stage feels unwarranted. Mr. Henderson has clearly demonstrated good faith in addressing concerns and is making visible improvements to his property. And his point about procedural adherence is well taken. We, as a board, need to ensure we are following our own rules meticulously. Carol finally found her voice, though it was strained. But the community standards, the appearance, he's flouting everything. Actually, Carol, Mr. Henderson spoke up from the back again. From what I've seen, he's improving Lot 17 considerably. It was an eyesore for years. And as for community standards, I think respecting a new neighbor's right to settle in without immediate harassment should also be a standard we uphold. Sarah nodded vigorously in agreement. Carol looked like she wanted the earth to swallow her. Her carefully constructed case, her attempt to publicly humiliate and financially cripple me, had not only failed but had spectacularly backfired. She was the one who now looked unreasonable, petty, and incompetent. I move, said Mrs. Albright, her voice clear and decisive, that all pending violation notices against Mr. Henderson regarding the matters discussed today be dismissed, and that the board take no further action on these specific complaints, provided Mr. Henderson continues with his stated landscaping plan. Seconded, said Mr. Grumbles immediately. Carol looked aghast. You can't just... We can, Carol, Mr. Grumbles interrupted, a new steel in his voice. We are board members. We are voting. All in favor of Mrs. Albright's motion. Both Mr. Grumbles and Mrs. Albright raised their hands. Carol and Mildred sat frozen, outvoted. The motion carries, Mrs. Albright declared. Mr. Henderson, the board considers these matters closed. We apologize for any undue stress this has caused you, and we will be reviewing our internal procedures regarding violation notices to ensure greater clarity and consistency in the future. I felt a wave of triumph, so pure and satisfying it was almost dizzying. Thank you, members of the board, I said, trying to keep the elation out of my voice. I appreciate your fair consideration. Carol pushed her chair back violently, scraping it loudly against the floor. This is a travesty, she hissed, glaring at her fellow board members. You're undermining the very fabric of this community. You'll regret this. She then turned her glare on me, a look of pure, unadulterated venom. This isn't over, Henderson. Not by a long shot with that dramatic but ultimately empty threat. She grabbed her purse and stormed out of the clubhouse, Mildred Perkins scurrying after her like a chastened poodle. Once they were gone, an almost palpable sense of relief filled the room. Mr. Grumbles actually chuckled. Well, that was overdue. Mrs. Albright smiled at me. Congratulations, Mr. Henderson. You handled that very well. It's not often Carol is put in her place so effectively. Mr. Henderson and Sarah came forward, grinning. "You nailed it, Alex," Sarah said, giving me a high five. "That was textbook." "Indeed," Mr. Henderson added. "Stood your ground, used the facts. That's how it's done." I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for weeks. "Thank you all," I said sincerely. "I couldn't have done it without your support and advice." We chatted for a few more minutes. Mr. Grumbles and Mrs. Albright assured me they would be pushing for more transparency and fairness in HOA dealings going forward. They even hinted that Carol's position as president might be facing a serious challenge at the next annual meeting, if not sooner. As I walked out of the clubhouse and into the now clearing afternoon sun, my heavy binder feeling suddenly light as a feather, I felt like a massive weight had been lifted. The battle had been won. Carol's reign of petty terror, at least as it pertained to me, was effectively over. She might grumble and glare from afar, but her power to harass me through official HOA channels had been severely curtailed. The following weeks were blissfully quiet. No more ominous envelopes in the mailbox. No more feeling like I was under constant surveillance. I could work on my ranch, build my chicken coop, and slowly transform the neglected property into my dream, without the shadow of Carol Pritchard looming over me. The news of the disastrous HOA hearing spread through the community like wildfire, mostly in hushed but gleeful tones. Carol, it turned out, had alienated more people than I realized with her officious ways. Her public dressing down and the subsequent shift in power on the board was seen by many as a breath of fresh air. Mildred Perkins reportedly became much more subdued. And Carol herself? She became a recluse. Her car was rarely seen slowly cruising past my property anymore. The sightings of her became infrequent. When I did occasionally glimpse her at the local store, she would pointedly turn her head and ignore me, which was perfectly fine by me. The best part was, with the HOA threat neutralized, I could finally focus on what I came here for. Peace, quiet, and the satisfaction of building something with my own two hands. The Whispering Pines Ranch was slowly but surely becoming the sanctuary I had envisioned. The pines seemed to whisper a little more gently now, or maybe it was just that the shrill voice of unwarranted accusation had finally been silenced. The true victory, I found, wasn't just in the formal dismissal of Carol's complaints, or even in her public humiliation at the HOA meeting. It was in the days and weeks that followed, in the quiet, uninterrupted rhythm of life at the ranch. It was waking up to the sound of birds instead of an alarm clock set early to deal with HOA nonsense. It was walking out onto my porch with a cup of coffee, surveying the land that was truly mine, without a knot of anxiety in my stomach about what new violation I might be accused of. The peace was palpable. My neighbors, particularly Mr. Henderson and Sarah, became genuine friends. We'd share tools, advice, and occasional evening beers on one of our porches, watching the sunset. Other residents, who had perhaps been wary of Carol's reaction if they were seen fraternizing with the enemy, started to open up. I received a few anonymous notes of encouragement in my mailbox. Simple things like, "Good job standing up to her," or "Glad you're here." It seemed I wasn't the only one who had longed for a shift in the local power dynamic. The HOA itself began to change. Mr. Grumbles and Mrs. Albright, true to their word, initiated a review of the bylaws and procedures. They pushed for more transparency, ensuring meeting minutes were promptly distributed, and that any proposed changes to rules were widely communicated and discussed before being voted on. There was even talk of term limits for board positions. At the next annual HOA meeting, which I made sure to attend, Carol Pritchard did not run for re-election as president. In fact, she didn't even attend the meeting. A new, much more reasonable homeowner was elected, someone who believed the HOA's purpose was to genuinely serve the community, not to act as a fiefdom for one person's control issues. It was a quiet revolution, sparked by a dispute over some moving boxes and overgrown weeds. I continued working on the ranch. The chicken coop was completed, and soon a small flock of hens were happily scratching in their run, providing fresh eggs daily. The landscaping plan I'd submitted, more out of principle now than necessity, was slowly taking shape. I planted a small vegetable garden, repaired the sagging porch roof, and gave the old ranch house a fresh coat of paint, a welcoming, earthy tone that blended with the landscape. It was hard work, but it was joyful work, the kind that settles deep in your bones and makes you feel connected to the land. Occasionally, I'd think back to that first day, standing on my porch, accused of being a burglar in my own home. Felt like a lifetime ago. The indignation and frustration had faded, replaced by a sense of quiet pride and a touch of amusement. I'd faced down the neighborhood Karen, armed with nothing but facts, a well-organized binder, and a refusal to be bullied. The lesson, I supposed, was that sometimes you have to fight for your peace. Sometimes the dream comes with unexpected dragons that need slaying, or at least HOA Karens that need to be firmly put in their place with their own rulebook. And the most satisfying part? I never had to resort to her tactics. I didn't get nasty, I didn't make personal attacks. I just used logic, evidence, and the system she thought she controlled. It turns out that a calm demeanor and a well-prepared argument can be far more powerful than bluster and baseless accusations. My ranch, the Whispering Pines, finally lived up to its name. The only whispers now were those of the wind through the trees, the gentle clucking of my chickens, and the quiet satisfaction of a dream defended and reclaimed. And if anyone asked, I'd tell them, yes, owning a slice of paradise is wonderful, but always read your HOA bylaws. And maybe invest in a good set of security cameras. You just never know when you'll need to document a hasty retreat of strategically placed rose bushes. The peace was hard-won, but all the sweeter for it.